Ladies and gentlemen, very excited to introduce the next permanent guest. Long teased for those of you that do watch the outros. If you don't watch my outros, why don't you watch my outros? Long teased, never introduced, finally today, very excited to announce Desmond Baby Grogu.
I'm just glad to be here.
You see, it balances out the
Not funny!
over my left shoulder, and now I have a angel over my right.
I think you're crazy.
Fantastic. Noam Chomsky, would you like to say anything to your new brother on the wall?
The Bible is probably the most genocidal book in our total canon.
Oh boy. Can already feel some tension going on between those two. I don't have a segue into this show. Experimental novels. What are they? What do those words even mean? Can a novel be experimental without adopting or contriving a new form? Are novels that were experimental a century ago still experimental now? Or have they been subsumed into the canonical and traditional? The honest answer is, I don't know. The Academy didn't want me when I tried to get a job with them, so I haven't put much thought into questions like that since I left. Regular viewers will note the red Snuggie hoodie, which means it's time to talk about some motherfucking books on my shelf. And all of these books, one is from the library, I will cop to that. All of these books have some kind of experimentalist tick to them. These are not necessarily my 5 favorite experimental novels, but they are 5 experimental novels you should think about reading, so I don't know, check it out. Starting off, I'm gonna go with Works by Edouard Leve. Tough to call this a novel, you know, and I will also admit that if you're going to read one Edouard Leve novel or book, then I would definitely recommend Auto Portraits. I've talked about, I think, some of these books, or at least mentioned all of them before. I think Auto Portrait is kind of the best distillation of all of his work, or the best consummation, if you will. As for this book, Works is a collection of about 533 different artistic works that are conceived or conceptualized by the author, but that have not been taken out. In fact, the very first work of the book is a book describes works that the author has conceived but not brought into being. Subsequently, there were a few works in this book that Leve went on to make into actual books. He was also a photographer. He made photography books, and so one of his photography books was about cities in America that had names of, like, I think mostly European capitals, famous European cities. So there's like a Paris, Texas, there's an Athens, Georgia, I assume Ithaca might have been on there. You get the idea. There's 2 sides to the coin of this novel, because on the one hand, you view this sort of mini encyclopedia as almost like a tragedy of unrealized works, right? But on the other hand, I like to think of it as this kind of celebration of cerebral exuberance. I was thinking this could be the 534th works, could be like a cost roster or like a cost estimate of what exactly it would take to create all of these things, because a lot of them, some of them are like simple films or paintings, but others are, you know, maybe a set of paintings taken out over a decade, or huge, large undertakings. One of them is like a matchstick scaffold that's set alight. So you think about, you know, like I'm imagining one of those like 4 to 5 story scaffolds you see in New York City, and, you know, each matchstick is like this big, and so I'm thinking of the tedious amount of time and the number of people you'd have to get together to make that. It's fun to think about. This book is, like, in a weird way kind of contagious. I actually, one of the things that I did shortly after reading this was, back when I had a Tumblr blog, one of the things I did on my Tumblr blog was I would make up my own works. They were mostly bad. I feel like the one good one that I did was, it was something like a basic cable television station starts running promos for a new series called Waiting for Godot. And and it's like a bunch of tramps, and they're waiting at a bus stop, or they're waiting at a train station, or they're waiting at a park. And basically the promos run for years, and the TV show never exists. See? Cheeky, funny. That's the dumb shit I would do if I was ever a TV producer, which is why I never will be. Yeah, it's like this encyclopedia of ekphrasis. But there's also something that feels very raw and out of the notebook, and sort of that much closer to maybe the brain or the, I don't know, scribblings of Edouard Leve. There's this weird kind of intimate reading experience where you feel like you're kind of reading the raw thoughts of an author. I find it a deeply encouraging novel, and just a raw exercise of imagination run amok. Next up is Lost in the Cosmos by Walker Percy. I've talked briefly, I think, about this book before on this channel. One of the reasons I definitely have to include this in this video is that I have seen in multiple instances this book classified not as fiction, but as either, in the nonfiction section, either as comedy, which is, you know, I think a fair assessment, still think it's more of a novel, or sometimes very funny, it has been in the self-help section itself. So, like, at that point, right, you've won satire, if you can do that. May we all be so lucky. It is by any accounts a novel, like I said. It just uses the self-help genre or format, oftentimes in like these really involved philosophical, it deals a lot with semiotics and the self specifically, but also a lot with just philosophical in a lot of sci-fi like scenarios too, and it'll give you these elaborate kind of thought experiments, and then it'll give you a multiple choice question, which are, each of the multiple choices are like sort of digressive and weird in their own ways, so that it ends up, you know, kind of leaving the reader with just as many questions and uncertainties as when they started. And, you know, of course, this is all after a big blustery intro where it's like, this is the last self-help book. That's the subtitle of the book, The Last Self-Help Book. Like I said, it deals with the self and semiotics, and honestly kind of serves as a really interesting entry point. That was my entry point into what semiotics was. I don't know, I was like 21 when I first read this. I was pretty young. There's a lot of sci-fi in it. It reminds me of, if you've ever seen the movie Arrival, you know, the movie where there's aliens and they solve it with language. Gosh, wonder why I would like that movie and also, you know, be making this comparison. There's certain thought experiments, though, that are like very similar to the premise of that movie. Lost in the Cosmos also, there's a lot of like intertextuality, or a lot of it plays a lot off of A Canticle for Leibowitz as well. But yeah, it's a lot of existential philosophy and experiments with 80s and also like 1980s pop culture and ennui. I think it balances the ability to be emotionally honest and tongue-in-cheek in a fairly successful way. So the book kind of starts off with a 20-question multiple-choice self-help quiz to test your knowledge of the peculiar status of the self, yourself, and other selves in the cosmos, and your knowledge of what to do with yourself in these, the last years of the 20th century. Some of the questions, or I don't know, sections, because they do each run a couple pages, are titled The Amnesic Self, Why the Self Wants to Get Rid of Itself, The Nowhere Self, How the Self, which usually experiences itself as living nowhere, is surprised to find that it lives somewhere, The Fearful Self, Why the Self is so afraid of being found out, The Bored Self, Why the Self is the only object in the cosmos which gets bored. Ironically, this is the only Walker Percy that I've ever read, the only full book I've ever read, which I'm really hoping to change in this coming year. I actually own The Moviegoer and what's it called? The Thanatos Syndrome, I believe. I think that's the one I own. But yeah, like, I love this book. This is like an all-time favorite. And yet, I have failed to follow up in Walker Percy. I've started The Moviegoer a couple times, and I'm like, don't know if I'm gonna love this, but come on, Nate. HHhH by Laurent Binet, I think is how you would say it if you were French. I am not, or at least I'm mostly not. What kind of white are you? Mostly not French. So, proud of that. But yes, there is probably some in me. The HHhH stands for Himmler's Herrn heißt Friedrich. Binet is, I believe, a history professor, and so this is a historical novel about the Nazi Reinhard Heydrich, who was the head of the SS. Himmler was the second in command in the Nazis. Heydrich was his brains, his heads, and he was one of the architects of the final solution. And sort of the experimental bent in this novel is that I've seen it described as like a meta novel. It is both kind of a novel, and it is kind of an active construction of research and revision as you read it. A lot of the sections, like he's telling, you know, the story, and then he's telling you how he researched this, and then he's telling you like, oh, this is where I guessed or projected a little bit. And he's, like I said, kind of, it's an active thing. He's sort of writing it like you're getting the story as he's putting this all together. And so you get, there's this whole bit where there's this expensive book of memoirs that he's trying to decide whether or not he's going to buy, because it's by, I think, Heydrich's widow or something. And so there's this whole like tortuous like, oh, I can't afford this, and then he breaks down and he's like, I'm gonna afford it, and then he reads it and he's like, it wasn't that useful. And so it shows this kind of whole stopping and starting and difficult process of, you know, writing all together. One of the other things that the sort of meta-novel structure allows the author to critique is how, so the book has Heydrich's name in it, and he constantly calls it his Heydrich novel. He says in the book that he constantly talks about the book he's writing, his Heydrich novel, but Heydrich is not the main character. In fact, the main character are two British trained spies, like parachuter troops, that are dropped into Nazi-occupied. One of them's Czech, one of them's Slovak, Czechoslovakia, back when it was all one country. And their names are Joseph, or Josef, I'm guessing is how you say it, Joseph Gabčík and Jan Kubis. And, you know, there's a great irony in writing a book whose main character's names aren't in the title. In fact, it's the guy that they are sent in to kill. Their whole mission is that I mean, spoiler alerts, because history, they do kill Heydrich. And so he's able, despite the fact that you know, obviously know that, and he's telling you that's where this book is going, he's able to, I think this is one of the really successful things about like the structure of it, is that it's giving you a kind of tension that's on top of, you know, the essential kind of spy thriller essence of, you know, parachuting into Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia and trying to take out the third or fourth baddest dude in the Nazi regime. The construction of it and the halting, helter-skelter process of that as you read it helps create a lot more tension and breaks things up, but also makes you want to keep reading it. It's definitely one of those books that I will always remember, just kind of the thrill, really latching onto the thrill of reading it the first time I read through it. It's one of those novels I'm absolutely jealous of anyone that's, ever tells me they're reading it for the first time, because it's like, oh, I wish I could go back and do that. The story is told in numbered section. There's, I think 256 or 257 sections, so they average about a page, but the sections are so short that it reminds me of like the reading experience of like a Kurt Vonnegut novel. It's because the chunks are so just quick to, rip off, like you feel like you're making progress every 90 seconds, more tangibly, I think, than in some longer books. That's a way in which the internet has wrecked my brain, in which this book is trying so helpfully to make up for. But that just makes it, I think, so readable. It's always been kind of that way, even pre-internet. And the reading experience really is one of like revision and projection. And so in that sense, you are kind of reading the novel as it is produced. Like the book Works that I was talking about by Edouard Leve, there's sort of a raw, directly from the writer's journal feeling that you get about this book. I like it. Read it. Fourth book on my list is The Assignment, or On the Observing of the Observer of the Observers by Friedrich Durrenmatt. I can't quite remember how I came across this book. I'm pretty sure it was like on Goodreads or something, but I was immediately sold on the concept of it. It's pretty short. It's like 130 pages long. It's 24 chapters, but each of those chapters is a single sentence. So there are only 24 sentences in the book. Easy read, right? The story concerns a filmmaker named F, who is hired to do an investigation into the apparent rape and murder of a famous psychiatrist's wife at something called the Al-Hakim Ruins. This takes place in an unnamed country, but it's pretty obviously supposed to be in the Middle East. So that investigation is the assignment, and obviously, because the protagonist is a filmmaker, and always has a film crew in tow, this book is subject to, a lot of interesting metaphors and framings and digressions on stuff that I love, themes I love, like cameras and surveillance and, kind of existence as a function of observation, I guess you could say. You can tell by its subtitle that there's going to be a lot of kind of Drost-like effects going on in the whole book. It's a very bizarre book. It's a very bizarre read. For one, obviously, a filmmaker is hired to do the investigation of the crimes as opposed to, a crimes person. What do they call those? Police. And that tells you already something particular about the nature of the request. I would describe this book as like a Baudrillardian John le Carré novel. Interesting comparison to make. So I talked about the previous book, HHhH, and how its kind of short staccato sections really propel it to be kind of a consuming read. This book almost aesthetically does the opposite, but it achieves the same result, right? The chapters are still, relatively short, but there's a length to them that you almost have to read them all in like one whole breath, right? Often the way it ends up working is that you go through kind of the long gasps of each sentence, but I found myself needing to sort of pause and go back earlier in the chapter to kind of regain my footing, and so a lot of what you end up doing is sort of scanning back and forth and observing that much more and re-observing, previous parts of the sentence that you started on. Much is made in this book about, trying to capture the entire whole on film, or else to confirm reality through film. Once you're being propelled through the grammatical suspense of the sentence itself, and on the other hand, you're pausing and checking back and reading carefully, trying to sort of parse through different antecedents to make sure you know what's going on. So at least in my reading of it, there was somehow this kind of combination of being a fast-paced spy thriller, meets a slow, careful, meditative reread. I think one of the most effective ways you can write experimental literature is to give the reader some kind of experience that reinforces the events or the occurrences of the book, somehow gives the reader in their reading that kind of immediate experience of the overall theme or the overall message of the book. And finally, number 5 on this list, I'm going to go with Bartleby & Co. by Enrique Vila-Matas. This was the first Enrique Vila-Matas book I ever read, and I just finished my reading my second, which was Dublin-esque. I talked a bit about it in my wrap-up, 2022 wrap-up video, but reading that book made me want to in part revisit this book, and so I picked up a copy at my local library. The framing of this book is that the novel is a series of footnotes to an incomplete or invisible text, and each of these footnotes introduces the reader to a different literary Bartleby, someone who would prefer not to. Bartleby the Scrivener is a novella by Herman Melville. I had not read the book before I read this one. I don't think it's necessary to either. You only really need to understand the archetype of, what a Bartleby is, and, EVM takes care of you in that regard. And so the narrator of this book is an author who has not written a book in 25 years. And so naturally, the thing that he writes after not writing is about a series of writers, real and made up, who for various reasons also said no to writing for extended periods in their lives. It's a beatification of the authors of no. Having now read 2 books by EVM, I do get the sense that he writes a lot of stuff that will be very interesting to me. And I think the word no for me is as, powerful and important as the word yes is in Ulysses. I love finding the theme or celebration of the word no throughout literature. One of my favorite examples of this is The Third Policeman by Flann O'Brien, and I'm going to read a line from that book that I think encapsulates this pretty well. I retired from the world in order to try to comprehend it, and to find out why it becomes more unsavory as the years accumulate on a man's body. What do you think I discovered at the end of my meditations? I felt pleased again. He was now questioning me. What? That no is a better word than yes, he replied. And whether it was meant in that way or not, I really feel like that is a direct challenge coming from, one Irish comic master to another, that's Flann O'Brien in some sense, sticking up for the word no against Ulysses' yes, so to speak, within the Irish tradition. I think there's at least some of that sort of metatextually, if playfully, going on there. I think there's great humor in humanity in the word no. No is resistance, right? And is in that way kind of the paragon of autonomy. One of the ways this cropped up recently was in David Graeber's Dawn of Humanity, and sort of the notion of culture as refusal, right? So essentially defining yourself as not those assholes over there, but that this is kind of one of the central tenets around which culture itself is built, around which autonomy itself is built, is that word no. One of the things this has in common with the book Dublin-esque is a concern for writing in the new millennium, in the 21st century, and sort of the direction of where writing is going. And what this writer does is fling himself into the study of these kind of authors of various silences, hoping either to find something for himself or to otherwise leave behind something for the reader to divine the future out of. And so there you have it, 5 of my favorite experimental books of literature. There are many, many that I have on my list and that I'm excited to read, but if you have recommendations based on any of these that you think I'd like, please drop them down in the comments below. Thank you, as always, for watching, and I am going to let the Archbishop take us out today.
When an elephant is sitting on the tail of a mouse and you say, I am neutral, the mouse is not going to be particularly pleased about your neutrality. You have already made a decision.